Why have sanctions increased so much as this weapon of economic violence? I think it's because they can get away with it, because very few people know that this is what sanctions are doing. I think once it becomes known, they won't be able to get away with it.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. A groundbreaking new study published in the British medical journal The Lancet Global Health finds that unilateral economic sanctions, most of which are imposed by the United States, leads to about 564,000 excess deaths around the world each year. Up to half of these excess deaths are children. While sanctions are often touted as an alternative to military force, this research shows that they can devastate public health, drive food and medicine shortages, and cause mortality rates to spike in ways comparable to armed conflict. In fact, this research shows that these sanctions are about as deadly as military conflicts around the world each year. Joining me to discuss this new study is one of the authors, Mark Weisbrot of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. We kick off discussing his key findings and then have a conversation about how and why economic sanctions end up killing so many people worldwide. This study did cause some shockwaves when it was released in mid-July. I learned a lot from this conversation, and I suspect you will as well. And as always, a big thank you to those of you who are paid subscribers to this show. Thank you for helping me keep this show going and on into the future. You can get a paid subscription at a discount by following the links in the show notes of this episode. Now here is my conversation with Mark Weisbrot of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Mark, thanks so much for joining me today. Just to kick off, can I have you explain what did you seek out to learn and discover, and how did you go about finding that?
We did an estimate, basically, based on 50 years and especially the last 10 years of data on how many people annually die from economic sanctions, the broad and unilateral economic sanctions especially, but how many people die each year. And these are sanctions that are primarily implemented by the United States government, economic sanctions. And it turned out to be pretty high. It was an estimate of 564,000 people annually worldwide, which is comparable to the number of people who die from armed conflict all over the world.
And what are the causes of death? Like, what's the causal relationship between economic sanctions and an excess mortality?
I mean, there are quite a few. And of course, a lot of there were dozens of studies before this and weekly reports. For example, we know the most about Venezuela because my co-author in particular, he was at Bank of America and Torino Capital, and they did reports on Latin American countries, and the ones on Venezuela were very detailed. And so you could see it happening. You could see, for example, when the sanctions hit and when they got worse, people wouldn't be able to get medicine, and then they lost food as well. And so you have, for example, in our study, which is a study of all these countries with sanctions, but it's using panel regression for 152 countries of data. But in our overall results, the majority of the deaths were actually children aged from 0 to 5, under 5 years old. And that's the majority of people who died as a result of sanctions from this estimate. That's consistent with a lot of other research. You have research on how many people die from recessions in developing countries by economists, and you have the World Food Organization publishes research, and what it shows is that you get a lot of children who, when they're malnourished, basically, they will die from childhood diseases, like diarrhea and measles, that wouldn't ordinarily kill them. So that's why it's so much disproportionately children.
So the idea essentially is that economic sanctions produce economic hardships on entire populations, and economic hardships in general and recessions in general have long been linked to excess mortality rates.
Like I said, there are many ways, but that's one way. When you damage the economy, many things will happen. And one of them is, that people have less food. First of all, you lose your imports that you need for production. So that also weakens the economy and everything that people need. You have worse health infrastructure. So you'll see, electricity will be less available. So hospitals are slowed down and can't provide medical services. You lose pharmaceuticals that you would be importing, and you lose all kinds of imports that have to do with people's basic needs. And of course, people lose their jobs as well. And, look at Venezuela. Again, that's the most documented example. They had a depression, which is the worst depression ever in history, without a war, a loss of 71% of GDP. And the majority of that was from the sanctions. It started a little before the sanctions, but the majority of that was from the sanctions. That's 3 times the size of what we lost in the Great Depression. You can imagine that. 7 million people left the country. So, when this happens, there are so many avenues. But let me give you one example, see, because, we did this in a way econometrically that demonstrated causality, as much as you can without having the standard of, randomized controlled trials where you put people into groups and, compare the groups. And so, you can see it in real life. And, one way they really are responsible for most of what happened to the people of Venezuela since 2015, at least, is you can see the sanctions prevent them from getting rid of hyperinflation. Now, hyperinflation is an extreme form of macroeconomic failure. People don't want to hold the currency at all. Okay, they get domestic currency, they get paid, they sell something, and they immediately go and convert it into dollars. Okay. And in the extreme case, hyperinflation by economists is defined as inflation over 15,000% a year. And that's what they have. And now you could say, well, what do countries do about hyperinflation? Well, there were 7 cases of hyperinflation in Latin America since World War II, and the median one lasted 4 months. Venezuela lasted 3 years. 3 years of hyperinflation, which is just a ferocious destruction of the economy. There's nothing left. So that's what they had. And that was completely a result of the sanctions, okay? Because Venezuela had 3 billion barrels of oil in the ground. You're never going to see Saudi Arabia go broke, okay? Not very easily, okay? So you could borrow against that if you weren't cut off from international finance. And then when you have some hard currency, you can get rid of the hyperinflation. Actually, in many cases, it's easier to get rid of than just a high inflation rate like 100 or 150%. And because you can do what these other countries have done. When they have hyperinflation, you get some reserves of dollars, you tie your currency to the dollar. And within a short time, it took 10 days in Bolivia in the 80s, for example. In a relatively short period of time, people realize that they don't have to get rid of their domestic currency, that it's actually going to be worth something the next week or the next month or the next year, maybe even. And that's the end of the hyperinflation. Okay. It's the hyperinflation creates this downward spiral. People are getting rid of their currency. That causes the currency to fall. that increases the price of everything imported. That raises inflation, and that just spirals downward with no end. And the end comes when you can actually access the international financial system and get rid of it. So there you go. Right there, you can see how sanctions can destroy an entire economy.
So you've mentioned Venezuela a few times now. Am I to understand that, say, the majority of these excess deaths, northwards of 500,000, are coming from just like a few select places? Is Venezuela what's driving the aggregate number of excess deaths worldwide? Or are there other examples that are also a significant contributor to this really massive number of deaths that you cited from sanctions?
25% of countries have sanctions against them in the world, and that's up from like 8% in the 1960s. So it has become much more prevalent, and you do have people dying in many countries.
Where?
I mean, that's hard to estimate from this kind of a study. I mean, you know that there's some obviously that you can see, like Iran is another one. Zimbabwe was another one, and Iran still, of course. And you have Afghanistan, where the Taliban took over the $9 billion their central bank reserves, which of course you can't function very much economically when your central bank reserves are gone. So they're still doing very bad. They're already the poorest country in Asia. Oh yeah, and I mean Haiti. The United States cut off everything from other countries. That Haiti was very poor and dependent on foreign aid. And in 2000, our government didn't like the election results, and so they were able to get almost every country to cut off all aid until they could overthrow the government in 2004, which was the second time that the United States intervened to overthrow the first democratically elected government of Haiti. So there's a lot of examples where a lot of people died. But the thing is that econometrically, it's hard to get a solid estimate for just one country. That's
Mhm.
why we use this big panel regression.
So you said a statistic that I find hard to believe. I'm not saying it's not true. It's just shocking to me that 25% of all countries are under some sort of sanction today. That's almost 50 countries in the world. That seems exceedingly high.
It's really increased and it's increasing. And we can talk about why that is. But there's no dispute over that. I mean, that's public record.
And just to be clear, when you say that, 25% of all countries in the world are under some sort of sanctions, you're not including, say, citizens from countries who are under some sort of individual targeted sanctions, like an asset
That would
freeze.
include some targeted individual sanctions, but those can actually cause quite a bit of damage. First of all, when you come under any kind of sanctions from the United States, a lot of businesses, financial institutions, they just won't go there
Mhm.
because they know that bad things very easily happen next. Because sanctions are usually the first step in some kind of bigger cutoffs. You lose your money from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and even the IMF when you're desperate. And so those things are next in the pipeline. So that already does something, but it also has a direct impact because you have the individual sanctions are very often the people who represent the government around the world, and they're not so easily replaceable. There are a lot of commerce and relations are dependent on personal relationships too. So I've seen countries hurt by that as well.
So your paper and your study distinguishes between US sanctions and EU sanctions on the one hand, and UN sanctions on the other, which are multilateral sanctions, which are, sanctions ostensibly passed by the Security Council and an obligation for every country, every individual in the world to abide by. And you have countries like North Korea that are under rather broad UN sanctions for their nuclear program, but you demonstrate that these UN sanctions are not as deadly as US sanctions. Why is that?
We didn't say that they don't harm or kill anybody. We reported the regression results, and so it didn't turn out to be significant. So we don't really know We can say that we don't know that they're killing people or how much to get an estimate, but we can't say that they don't. I'm sure some of them do. Now, the question is why? And that is, I think they'd have to be less harsh in some ways or have some exceptions, but it's really hard to say.
Hmm. Well, it may be, I mean, just extrapolating from what I know based on the UN, often these UN sanctions do have humanitarian carve-outs rather explicitly integrated into the sanctions resolutions passed by the Security Council. They also often don't completely exclude countries from the international financial system, which is something really only under the provenance of the United States because of the dominance of the dollar.
That's right. That's part of the power that the United States has, and sanctions are a part of it. I mean, let's face it, I gave the one example of Haiti, where the sanctions were used explicitly for regime change. And Pompeo said that out loud in 2019 a couple of times about how the sanctions were really actually targeting the civilian population. And then he stopped saying that because
Of
somebody,
Venezuela in this case.
this was Venezuela and
Yeah.
Iran. He made the
Yeah.
same statement about Iran. So that's partly what it's about. And of course, I would say again, I can't present evidence for that, but I think when the U.S. puts you under its unilateral sanctions, that's more of an indicator that bad things are going to happen, and they're going to keep happening for as long as you have a government in Washington that wants them to happen.
What do you hope policymakers make from your study, learn from your study?
Well, this is the problem. I mean, why have sanctions increased so much as this weapon of economic violence? I think it's because they can get away with it, because very few people know that this is what sanctions are doing. I think once it becomes known, they won't be able to get away with it in the world. And so it will stop. I gave some examples in that piece in the LA Times of other fights that were won in the United States within the Congress in particular, or by executive order when President Obama ordered an end to the CIA's torture program, the official one, the waterboarding and all that. So most people think this is horrible when they hear about it, and mostly they don't hear about it. So that's the biggest thing. Now, in terms of the regressions themselves in this study and what it shows, it does make a stronger case, but I don't know how much it was really needed as to the causality that the sanctions really do cause this very large number of deaths.
Mark, thank you so much for your time. I'll post a link to the Lancet piece in the show notes of this episode.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.